Alrighty, guys. Today we are talking the formula that I use to help me quickly create dungeons for my Westmarches style Dungeons and Dragons campaign. So, dungeons. Now, I believe when you're new to role playing games, at least when I was, I feel like other people may not have had this experience. But like dungeons are all you know. You know, the first couple of times you play, you're the only game you're playing is D&D. And, the thing you do in your session is go into the dungeon and clear it out. And then you get some more experience with D&D. You watch some videos online, you play Vampire the Masquerade for the first time, and then you come to discover, oh my god, like dungeons, what a simple-minded waste of time to walk into a room and attack a goblin with a club. Especially when you can just be sitting around writing this like epic, writing your own Ulysses with your friends around the tables. You can just be sitting in town all day, just talking and role playing with other people. Like that's what the whole game is about. That's what separates D&D RPGs from, playing Hero Quest. Like why would I want to sit in a dungeon and kit stuff when I can be writing the next great American novel over here? And then you get some more experience with RPGs and D&D, and you come to realize like, oh, wait a second. All right, yeah, just sitting around and talking usually gets to this point where it doesn't amount to anything. Like you just end up with this like waiting for Godot situation where you just talk, and then it's like you get in this weird existential. So what you come to discover is that okay, actually dungeons, maybe they are actually useful and convenient. They are a way to, just constantly have tension. You're going from room to room and you're constantly being set up with, okay, situation is presented before you. How do you deal with this? And which is really the core, the fun part of like role playing games is like getting through this situation. And dungeons are a great excuse to have that just happen back to back to back to back to back over and over and over. So yeah, after you play a whole lot of RPGs, you do actually come back around and you come to realize like, oh, okay, so there is actually a reason why they like base the whole game around dungeons and like why dungeons are becoming like a thing and why people are running them and why people have fun with them. But dungeons can be a little bit hard to make, and I do think I generally prefer a like orchestrated, just like entirely set up and prepared like session and series of encounters rather than a dungeon. But the dungeon does have the convenience factor, the like, it's like the fast food meal of like the sessions, you or not, no, it's not like the fast food meal, it's like the frozen meal kind of. But it's like I like frozen meals. Maybe that's just me. But you can just make like okay, actually no, it's not like a frozen meal. It's like meal prep. That's what the dungeon is like. Because you can make like 10 of them just in advance, and then all you need is like 15 minutes of prep time of figuring out okay, why do players want to go to dungeon? What is connecting them? Tie it into the plot a little bit. You need like just a few minutes of prep time to figure that out, and then you just got the whole series of encounters, and the rest of the whole session is just ready for you to throw it out in front of your players. Now there's a couple like formulas and techniques that are common and like spread across when you ask the question like, okay, well, how do I write a dungeon, how do I make one? The number one first one that comes up all the time, the 5 room dungeon. Now the 5 room dungeon is like a good idea, I think. It's very, very, very simple, I would say. It basically suggests like, okay, your dungeon needs 5 things, like the entrance, and then a couple of things, and then a boss fight, and then a reward. And I do generally agree that like a good proper dungeon should have those like 5 elements. And the 5 room dungeon also suggests that there should be like a flow, that you should go from one of these states, one of these rooms, so they don't necessarily have to be rooms. They just like are a stage of, the story. You move from one to the next. And so, or like, not even move. You could be like time movement, like one happens after the other. And so from that angle, I think Five Room Dungeon is useful, but from the fact that it's like just so incredibly like bare boned, or like I think like the Five Room Dungeon is just like the bare minimum for a dungeon. So from that angle, I don't think it's particularly useful. I guess if you know absolutely nothing, it's a good place to start. Then there is the like you go from the Five Room Dungeon approach to the uh, Jaquang the dungeon, and that is just like a huge step forward in complexity. I find, right? I think the Jaquang, I think it's got a lot of good dungeon design ethos and philosophy of not treating it like a just linear room end. It's just like a whole complex, like an entire just maze that you can move from. There's just it's like a house, or like it's like a real building that would actually exist, like a and so Jaquan, I think useful, but it mostly seems like like the original blog of like Jaquan the dungeon seems like it was written for like mega dungeons, because at least like half of what it tells you to do has to do with depth and elevation and connecting different levels in different ways, which is all good stuff if you're making like a 6 floor dungeon. And most of the time, I'm trying to make a dungeon that can be completed in a single session. So usually never more than 2 floors. Usually like one, just a single level. I'm making my dungeon because I'm trying to make it completable in like 2 to 3 hours. I'm not trying to run my entire campaign or like 6 sessions in this campaign. Not saying there's not a value to the mega dungeons. I very much so enjoy a mega dungeon from time to time, but it's not my default. It's not my standard. So for my standard, for my default, I've sort of come up with this little dungeon formula. Uh, can consider it like just a list of elements that I think should be included in dungeon, possibly as like a sort of questionnaire, starting off just like what this was before it was a dungeon, history, theme, physically, like what is this dungeon? Is it just a natural thing like a cave, a cavern, or the likes? Or was it like a literal fortress or outpost or something constructed by man? Like who built it, or how did it come to be in the world? And what function did it originally serve when it was created? And then you have to figure out who lives in it now. And lastly, you got to figure out like who wants what from the dungeon. Does a noble want to recover an item that a bugbear chieftain stole? Do they want the big boss killed? Do they want him captured for information? Uh, those are like the 3 goals I can think of off the top of my head, but I'm sure given some more thought, you can come up with some more unique goals for your dungeon. And also, I would use this first, just figuring out the general guideline of your dungeon. I would try to, tie it into the plot. And by tie it into the plot, I mean specifically the plot of your characters. Why I always, I at least with this West Marches style, I've less so focused on any sort of overarching plot. That doesn't exist at all. There is just the characters and what they want to eventually accomplish. And usually this involves an enemy of the characters having some connection or tie to the dungeon. So either one of their rivals or nemesis has either some sort of alliance or friendship with one of these dungeon inhabitants, like the lieutenant of the dungeon, or they have some stakes in it. Like if they lose this dungeon, it would be a negative for their rival or nemesis for a reason, or it just directly belongs to one of them. I would use one of these reasons, and this is the kind of thing that I would figure out in those like 15 minutes of prep time, that plot tie-in to get the character to the dungeon. And so once you got the general idea, usually where I will start next is I will figure out, I'll skip right near towards the end. I skip right to figuring out who's the big boss gonna be, and what's gonna be this like cool climatic, what's gonna be the cool part of this boss fight. Generally you can just steal from video games. I like the most recent thing I've stolen is I forget his actual name, but like the Archdeacon, something like that, from one of the Dark Souls games where there's like 100 little dudes, but one of them is the real actual boss, and you got to just like cut through all of them to figure out who that is. I would say, play or some video games or something, find a boss fight you want to steal, and then steal it. And then, create that room, create that boss, put that all in there, and then the rest of the dungeon is figuring out how the players get to that. So next up, I would try to figure out what's outside of the dungeon. General lay of the land, the terrain. Is it hilly? Are there guys hiding behind trees or such? And if this is a more militarized, intelligent, sentient, like goblin camp, something along those lines, or a goblin hideout, bandit hideout, if it's not just straight up nothing but owl bears and boulets and the likes just hiding in a cave, they likely have some patrol, possibly. They have scouts if they have like reason to believe that, attackers might be near or threatening their dungeon. You could also try to come up with some like nearby inhabitants. Now, these might also just be monsters. There might just be a den of a, dragon or something that just happens to be close to the dungeon. There might be just a hermit hut with some hermit who's had some problems with these guys. There might be, possibly just like traveling NPCs or something. It can be something like a random encounter. I like throwing in them role playing opportunities whenever you get a chance, because once the dungeon begins, it can turn into a slog, especially if your players are the fighting types. But what's nice about that is when your players reach the dungeon, it really gives them, at least I find if you're doing it right, you give the players the opportunity to make this the kind of game that they want to make it. If they want to Far Cry room to room, assassinate everything before any alarms are triggered, make it into a real stealth mission, I'll find my players will try to do that. If I have a group with the people who want to just charge in and just start smashing skulls and they don't care about how much noise they make, I find they'll do that. And if they are the suave and the role players, they will interrogate and take hostage and try to convince every single enemy they come across to turn on their master. And, so I would just say, like, let your players make the dungeon what they want to make it. They can make it into the stealth game, they can make it into the violent, just smash stuff, or they can try to make it into this sort of intriguey cloak and dagger intrigue type of deal. Okay, so next up, you got to figure out how people get inside the dungeon. Figure out the entrances. Generally, I go for 3 entrances for my dungeons. The main entrance is obvious, the players just find it right away, but it's usually either guarded by enemies. You're going to take some losses, maybe not necessarily like losses like casualty wise, but you might lose some HP as you fight with whatever guards are just staring out there protecting the front door. It might be locked. You might have to spend some time picking it or trying to find a key, something along those lines. It might be trapped. You're going to lose some HP just trying to get in through the front door. And traps, a whole thing regarding traps and dungeons. There's a lot of discourse surrounding that. Obviously, there's the wrong way, TM of doing traps, of you move through such square, so you pay the HP tax. Generally, you want to avoid that, I would say. Try to incorporate traps into the plans of enemies. Try to use enemies to lure players into traps. Try to incorporate traps into combats so that they are just like an extra element that spices up. You walk up and hit the guy. Just trap sitting there by itself. If you're going to do that, I would lean towards making it obvious so that it is more like a deterrent, and that, like, okay, you can go through this way, but it's possible you might mess up moving past this trap, or possibly make it obvious and you can reverse it and possibly use the trap on the enemies by tricking them to walk through it. Next, you got a midpoint entrance. Now, this is either like the waterfall or the like hole, the pit in like the middle of the hill or something. This will let the players skip through like half the dungeon. They'll just end up straight in the middle of the dungeon, which can be either a good or a bad thing. It's quite risky if you just show up right in the middle and then alert everything to your location, and then 4 rooms worth of encounters all just all coordinate and attack right on your position. But you can use this to your advantage by just showing up where the enemies are likely not going to be expecting you if you're just right in the heart of their dungeon. But generally, to get inside or to get through the midpoint entrance, you're either going to need some extra form of mobility. You're either going to have to succeed some like climbing checks to traverse through like a cliff or something along those lines. You might have to have some means of like holding your breath underwater. You might have to like go through fire. It's not just going to be as simple as walking through a door. But it shouldn't necessarily be hidden. It should be something that like the players should be able to find and see as an option, and then they have to actively make the choice of, are we going to go through this midpoint entryway or are we going to go through the guarded way? And lastly, I always like to throw in a secret entrance. Now, these also I tend to have like show up as like ways to just get right into the middle of the dungeon. I also sometimes use them as like emergency escapes for certain rooms from like the creatures and enemies that are in there. And if you sneak in the reverse way, you can get the drop on them, but it's always hidden. You're gonna have to spend time or possibly get some information from someone to figure out where this entrance is. Okay, now once you got your entrances figured out, I always like to try to add like one hazard that makes this dungeon unique among the other dungeons. So for this hazard, this is something that I like affects either in the entirety or like at the very least more than half of the dungeon. The standard and the classic is it being dark. The players just have to carry a torch or a light source in order to see, unless they have got dark vision like 90% of classic good old D&D races. Another one I like is flooded, and not necessarily flooded might not be the right word, but just there's a number of inches of water on the floor, might make stealthing difficult, might make fire less effective. Possibly like electricity, lightning magic might even be more effective, or maybe not more effective, but has the ability to like spread out. There's a couple of things you can do with the dungeon wide hazard. Just something that that affects like nearly every room, that separates this from the last dungeon that they walked into. Um, yeah, kind of like having like, you know, the the stage hazards in Smash, you know? Except not really like that. This is more of like a Deep Rock Galactic mutators or StarCraft 2 co-op mutators modifiers. Except these aren't just entirely arbitrary. These exist for a reason. So the other things that I think dungeons I don't know if I necessarily want to say this separates good dungeons from bad dungeons because I don't think you need to have this in order to have a good dungeon. But I think for a lot of groups, it can be the most fun part of a dungeon, and that is some sort of role play opportunity. Now, I believe in the 5 room dungeon formula, they would label this the puzzle room. And one of their examples of puzzles is a role play encounter. I've got my own gripes with puzzles, so for the role play encounter, it's not very hard to jam one into your dungeon, and it's a way for them to learn about the either history or lore of the dungeon, or possibly learn about its current occupants. You can have either a defector, maybe one of the goblins doesn't want to die and he's willing to betray his chief in order to live. You can have just a captured prisoner that the players save. um, this one's a little more comedic, a little goofier, but if you, I've used this with the gnome magician before, but somehow someone has ended up in this dungeon and they are just completely lost. You can do the sentient object, a classic like little trope for D&D. It can be a stone face in the wall that like gives them riddles or something that they can talk to, or it could be hostile, it could be trying to trick them or trap them. uh, and the much more interesting, I would say, like role play opportunity to jam into your dungeon is the aspect of dungeon politics. Now, when it comes to dungeon politics, you can really go as simple or as complicated as you want. On the simple side of things, you might have a room with a giant crocodile that goblins are afraid to enter because they know that crocodile will eat them, so they avoid that room. And they've built their sort of base, and their movement through the room sort of reflects that. Or there can be multiple factions in this dungeon that war against each other for like territory and for rooms. You can go full on like Game of Thrones with your goblins and kobolds fighting in the dungeon if you want. I probably wouldn't waste my time with that because there's at least like a 50% chance the players aren't going to find out about any of it, as they just slaughter and break the necks and cut the heads off of everything they see that looks slightly evil and is standing in their way. But yeah, dungeon politics, I think that's the secret sauce. That's really what I have the most fun with when it comes to dungeons, is trying to play the dungeon against itself. And the encounter rooms. This is the meat of the dungeon. Now, I like the rule of threes. I like to stick with at least 3+ of these. This is just your room with bad guys in it. Now, obviously, I wouldn't just keep it that simple. You got to spice up that room. But all right, let's go down the list here really quick. So the combats should be easy. The players shouldn't be nearly dying or anything to these combats. The players should be pretty much smoking everything in there with relative ease. This is an opportunity for them to do their thing and sort of let them slip into a false sense of security as they just murder their way through the dungeon. Sometimes, they can get got. Sometimes even just a group of goblins, when they start flanking and ganging up, they can do some serious damage to you know, even high level players if they get really unlucky. Some things to consider: the doors. Are they locked? Are they barred? Are they stuck? Is there going to have to be time spent forcing them open through one means or another? Generally, when it comes to locks, you like every once in a while, I might do a little bit of the Doom thing with you got to get the blue lock for the blue key. You have to be able to you have to go to this part of the dungeon to get this thing. You got to pull this lever to open this portcullis in this part of the dungeon. I generally try to avoid those. Not necessarily because I think there's any like game design issue with them. In fact, I think they are, because backtracking isn't even a thing you have to worry about in D&D. You just say like, okay, now you guys have reached this point again. But I have difficulty coming up with like non-contrived ways for certain parts of the dungeon to be locked off until you reach a specific part of the dungeon. Because the levers and portcullises, like, all right, so are they digging mechanisms into the wall? Like, they don't have electricity or anything. They don't have Bluetooth. Is it just magic? Do they have magic in this goblin camp? Likely not. And these keys, they can usually just be ignored. The players can usually just pick the lock after some point or break the door open. So yeah, they're fine. I use them extremely sparingly though. And consider the original use of this room when it was built for the first time. It's versus its current use. What are the goblins? Do they make it into their card playing room? Was this once, the larder or something? Is there any remnants of that? Always throw stuff in rooms that your players can play with. You gotta have those environmental kills and all that. You gotta also always make sure your goblins are never just sitting in a room with their swords out, standing and just waiting for players to walk in. Well, unless they've been alerted and they are actively like setting a trap. But even that's something they're doing. Like creatures are always doing something. They're either asleep, they're either playing games, they're either eating, they're either setting a trap for the players. Make sure you got something that the enemies are doing, that they're not just little minions that you plopped down on the spaces and the board, that they are people with actions and histories and yada yada yada. And other things you can do: warnings, hints, clues to further rooms. If there's the owl bear in the next room, then you either have a smell emanating from that room that smells of owl bear dung, or I guess they probably don't produce dung, they produce whatever, urea or whatever they call that, like bird crap, or maybe owl pellets, like of giant carps or whatever. Mm, there can be goblins. They might be writing graffiti of warning of what's in the next room. You're gonna have to speak goblin if you want to be able to read it. But yeah, so clues, little tufts of fur for the fur monster in the next room. Always give the players the opportunity to take their time and plan their ideal path through the dungeon. And next, every dungeon, you gotta have a secret somewhere. You either need a shortcut, a secret path from one room to the next that gives the players the opportunity to either skip some rooms or save some time. Possibly it puts them in an advantageous position. And it can also just be like a secret treasure room just to get some extra loot. But I really, really like the Gauntlet for the Nintendo 64. You could get like over the course of the levels, you could find like I forget all of them, but you could find like the ice scimitar in the level where you fight the dragon, and then it like cuts off one of his heads and deals like a third of his health bar instantly. And now this doesn't necessarily have to be the you find the dragon slaying sword when the boss is a dragon. Yeah, I would try to be a little bit more subtle, a little more nuanced than that. It can be like a physical positioning thing, like you use this secret to end up in a place where you're now behind the boss, and or maybe there's a holy water cache from an ancient chapel or church or something that is now taken over by undead, something along those lines. But I like using the secret room as a means of like containing some sort of super efficient weapon to help you take out the boss. And this I think also serves as a nice little like game aspect thing where each room you might sit around here and spend like 10 minutes checking every single wall for secret rooms. And if you find the secret room, then you get the super weapon. But for each of these 10 minutes that you're spending just sitting around the room, it's possible that some roaming monsters might just wander in and attack you while you're looking for these secret rooms. And, then they're going to take away more of your resources. You're going to have less health and everything else to fight the boss. So it's a little bit of a gamble. Like, do we want to check every single room for the secret room, or do we just, not bother? The other thing about having it specifically be useful against the boss you're coming up against is that it incentivizes the players to do this before they like fight and clear out the entire dungeon, because if they clear out the entire dungeon of undead and then they find the secret trapdoor where they find the cache of 5 vials of holy water, like they still have 5 vials of holy water, which they can then use in the future, which is cool. But if they had it earlier, they could have used it to help against this threat that they are actively facing. It probably would have been very helpful against. Okay. Because technically you could just clear out the room and or clear out the whole dungeon and then just look for secret rooms afterwards. Which I like. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. And I've so far my players have yet to do that. And in fact, they've very rarely ever gone out of their way to look for secret rooms at all. They've only ever found them incidentally. And you need a calm room. This it doesn't necessarily have to be a safe room. It can be just as exposed to the dungeon as every other room in the dungeon. But it's for one, it's a pacing tool, and not every single room is just back to back fight, 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 fight. There are rooms where you can just breathe, and it can be tense when you're in a room with nothing because you might be expecting the trap, you might be expecting the whatever it is to pop up. And just because it's the calm room or safe room doesn't mean it has to be empty. It can have just little knickknacks or what have you of the dungeon, something that reveals a little bit more about either the boss or reveals a little bit more about the history of the dungeon. And generally, like if there is like a dungeon hazard, like if the whole dungeon is dark, this will be like one of those rooms that does have light in it. And as for the calm room, I would probably have, I guess it depends on the size of your dungeon. I would probably have like at least one empty room for every like 5 to 10 like other rooms that you have full of whatever it is that's in there. And the calm room, I also I when I like make my dungeons, I try to place it before the boss room as an extra like means of incentive to sort of have the players like use their short rest right before they go into the boss room. uh, and that's just for how I've sort of scheduled my uh, the like pacing of my sessions. Okay, and the boss room itself. I try my hardest to make this the last room that they come across. And obviously, when you take that inspiration from the Jaquan, the dungeon, and you have your encounter rooms intersecting and looping with each other, and it can be difficult to make this the case. But generally, you want to force them to go through at least a number of rooms before they can get to the boss room, I would say. I'm fine with sort of making that, concession, I guess, uh, with the design of my dungeon. And boss room, set piece encounter. I always, if I'm gonna do the like all out, this is the wild action scene room with the hanging chandelier and these magic pillars and the braziers with fire elementals popping out of them and whatever else. Like if I'm gonna have a room that I think I want the players to take back and remember about this dungeon, generally I don't want it to be like just a random throwaway room. I try to like really put everything into the boss room and really just ramp it up, dial it up to 11. Boss room, don't forget goons. If action economy still exists, if 5 players just walk up and just wail on one dude, he's gonna be gone in no time. You gotta have some other distractions to make sure the players don't just absolutely annihilate the boss in a matter of 12 seconds. And for the boss room, try to use any opportunity you can to hype up the boss, I would say. Make him seem scary. Have the bodies hanging and their heads on pikes outside the wall to really make him seem threatening. When they show up, have the boss like kill either a like prisoner or have him kill a one of the goons of the boss that is being insolent or what have you, and have the goons and the mooks, really talk up the boss, have them, tell the players like, oh yeah, you guys are gonna have no chance against Grim Bazaar, the bugbear chief of the West Haven or whatever, just make sure he's scary, make sure he's shown himself, proved himself as a combatant to be feared, as a force to be trifled with. And uh, I always like to have, there's this is probably the cheapest twist ever, but instead of having the boss be the real boss, he's always just phase one, and phase two might be like a literal actual like phase two to the boss. Like, oh, now he's at health, half health. Now he's angry, and I usually try to have some just completely unrelated like plot thing happen, just like directly, like a rival or nemesis, like either show up or be waiting outside the dungeon, or at some point after the dungeon the players will encounter him in that same one session, and then they get the real boss fight. um, and once they complete the dungeon, they got to take out that treasure, the loot. Now loot, can be tons of things. It can just be magic items or potions or scrolls or gold. It can be, armor or weapons or, it's pretty much anything you can conceivably sell, anything that people would want to buy, can be loot. Now, whether or not this is stuff that those monsters have stolen, that you've just stolen from these monsters and are now going to sell to other people, they can be things that possibly the monsters produce themselves. They can possibly be like materials from the monsters. Like you skin them and hide them and take their bones and sell that. You know, the monsters might be collecting stuff. You know, goblins like shiny things. Maybe they have a trophy room, something, or you know, maybe the mob boss himself had a magic item that the players just take off of him. Their arms and armors. It's likely that these monsters either raid or steal or loot, and you know you're just taking their you know, if you just find enough swords and scrap metal and scrap leather and scrap whatever, you can, you know, big enough bulk, you can make a decent chunk of change out of that. Or maybe they have like just utility supplies. They have food and water and medicine and things that people in towns need in order to survive. Because you know there's some way that they are surviving in this dungeon, um, and it's usually roughly along the same lines as what humans and other people need in order to survive. Last thing I like to come up with for any dungeon I'm running is a D4 table of wandering monsters or dungeon events. Three of them I make negative, like either like hostile monsters that are roaming around, or you know bands of evil, you know, encounter monsters types, or possible like dungeon events depending on the dungeon itself. uh, you know, kind of like a lair action. And I always like to have a neutral encounter as well that can randomly occur to the players. Now these wandering monsters, I'll have one of these possibly occur. There's a chart that I'll roll on for each 10 minutes that the players spend in the dungeon. Now, generally, if they are just like moving like room to room to room to room, they could conceivably complete an entire dungeon in under 10 minutes. Like that is not impossible. But if they are ever standing around and short resting, or if they are looking for secret rooms, or taking time to disarm traps, or pick the blocks of doors, it's very likely that they're going to be spending multiple tens of minutes in this dungeon. And um, yeah, so that's another thing. Is I myself as a DM, I am very anti dice fudging. I very much so believe in letting the dice fall as they may. If he dies, he dies, kind of a deal. Um, but my one exception, the one thing that I do not strictly adhere to when it comes to random encounters is, I'm sorry, the one thing I do not strictly adhere to when it comes to not fudging dice is the wandering monsters. Now, uh, for one, I do have a DM screen, but I only have the screen to like keep my notes. All my dice I roll in front of the screen for all combat and everything. And with combat, it's you know, I like I want my players to know if they would die. You know, if the goblin is an assassin and he has backstab, then you know I'm rolling that extra however many d6, and my players are seeing that this is the case. And you know, I do believe in that like rules. Maybe not rules as written is the term I'm looking for, but playing the game as like the rules like intend, I guess. But yeah, just running everything like as mechanically accurate as I can. But with random encounters, you know, my players don't know what my random encounter table looks like. So if it looks like they are struggling and I want them to be in a position where they can complete the rest of this dungeon, they might just happen upon a random encounter that happens to be neutral, that in however they go about it just so happens to be a positive benefit for them, and vice versa. You know, if they are just having way too easy of a time with the dungeon, if they're just mowing through everything and they're about to just kill the boss, and you know nothing has even like gotten in their way, I might throw some random encounters in there to take away a little bit more HP and just try to crank up the difficulty just a little more on them. And you know, it's likely that if they are in a position that I exactly want them in, it is, you know, I probably just won't have anything happen to them. And when I say random encounter, I would write like at least a line for each encounter, like at least a sentence. I would not just write like a troll wanders in. I would, you know, either like the troll is hungry and he smells food and he's, you know, knocking at the door of the room that the players are in. uh, Something along those lines. You know, I would be, because that's just going to be helpful for when I'm running the dungeon and I want to have this random encounter occur. You know, so I do recommend at least like a sentence per random encounter, not just X amount of monster equals random encounter. And as for physically writing, okay, well not physically writing, for you know planning the dungeon, I for making my dungeons, my go-to method, I go online, I find a one-page dungeon that either piques my interest or I think could be easily like converted or used in my world, or it just lines up perfectly with a rival or a nemesis that one of my players have, or there's like a plot line that's going on in one of their characters that this would be perfect for. I will take that one page dungeon and then I will modify it until it meets all of my requirements here. You know, if there's no secret room, secret path, or anything, I will jam in a secret path. If the boss is kind of lame, I will really amp it up to make that boss kind of cool. If there's only a single entrance to the dungeon, I will, you know, throw two more entrances into the dungeon. Just really, you know, modify a one page dungeon until it meets all of my requirements I have for it here. I'll, they don't usually have any sort of wandering monster chart. Sometimes they do, actually. They usually don't. So I'll usually come up with my own wandering monster chart, but it's a pretty quick method of coming up with an entire dungeon. It's been working out for me pretty well so far. I, yeah, no, that's it. All right, I'll see you guys later.